You're listening to a DM podcast.
Welcome to Over the Back Fence. I'm Di Edwards.
I'm Nicola Dale, and we're buddies of nearly 4 decades. And yes, we actually do happen to share a back fence.
We do. We love parties, people, inspirational stories, and honestly, making the most out of life.
So join us as we open our hearts, share our stories, and hear from some of the most inspirational people in the world. And have a laugh along the way.
Yeah.
Enjoy.
Hey guys, we're back.
We are
Everyone's
back.
going, oh my God. We've actually just got up front, this next one coming up.
Annabel Abbs.
We did an interview with an amazing woman who's written this incredible book called Sleepless. And it's a remarkable overview about people who have endured sleeplessness and insomnia way back, since the beginning of, the 19th century. And interesting take on it, isn't it, on being sleepless?
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of like gifts during the night, when you find yourself, when you are sort of awake.
I'm sure some people do.
They do.
Sorry.
But, creativity
Naughty
and the whole thing. But look, it was a wonderful, wasn't it a great chat, Jo? We had, but Annabel's she's actually in Bath in the UK. So this time we did the recording and we actually did it sort of from our home studio.
Look,
so there's
we
a
have
few
to
little
apologise because honestly
with the
that
sound.
night was a dark and stormy night. It was like when we had a lot of intense rain in Sydney, and it was the first time we'd done a podcast out of the studio. And it's actually a funny story because while we're interviewing, we've got Nicola at her place over the back fence, me and Annabel, as Nicola just said, in Bath. Okay, so we're doing the interview. Well, Nicola just disappears off the screen altogether, and I'm going, oh my God, I've lost my co-host. Great. Meantime, back at the ranch, I've got this storm with this rain pelting down on the skylight above me. I couldn't hear her. So my nostril hairs were on the screen and the producer's looking at me going, what the hell is she doing? Because that was the only way I could hear Annabel, and I was getting every sort of second word. But in my study at home, it was echoing. So look, it's actually, I think, amazing interview because there's so much for you to learn. But it turned out being quite funny. Nicola emerged. She came back. There she was.
I'm back.
It was miraculous. I went, there she is, So look, if you hear echoing or bits in this, my producer's been amazing to edit parts where we had to stop it. But putting all that aside, she was so inspiring.
I think you'll really love it, so it's with Sleepless because with the title of it too, it really is like the gifts. So, I mean, how did you sleep last night, Dodie?
I actually slept like a log.
There you go.
Yeah, but I did go out because Annabel said if you can go out and look at the stars. If you can walk amongst the stars, great, but some people live, major cities and 2 a.m. is not great to do that. But if you have that opportunity, walk out under the stars. I walked out of my balcony, looked up, and I did it for about 10 minutes. I try and do it most nights now. Thank you, Annabel. And I slept like a baby.
Wow.
Yeah. What about you?
That, and then there was the eclipse the week before that as well. So,
that always throws me, eclipses.
Yeah. No, look, we love the interview, and I'm sure
I don't
want to
say too much because there's so much to take on in the interview about this whole new take on insomnia. And don't forget, women are twice as likely to wake up than men at night. And it's got something, she'll explain about hormones and
but don't be scared of that too. So it's kind of, it was really reassuring for me.
It's a positive take on insomnia.
You'll love it. You'll absolutely love it.
Yeah, like get over the worry about not sleeping. She says embrace it. So do that with this interview. Ciao. Everybody, I hope we've got you all revved up because quite honestly, there's not a day that goes past in my life that I don't either hear from family or friends or I hear it in the news or social media. I didn't sleep well last night, or what do you do to sleep? Or there's always this questioning, and I came to the point where this book literally landed on my lap. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Annabel Abbs. Welcome to Over the Back Fence. I'd also like to say that Annabel has a new positive approach to sleeplessness with an emphasis on acceptance and not fear at the forefront. Annabel was unmoored by grief after a series of personal loss, though during wakeful nights she eventually found that the darkness became a sanctuary filled with creativity, reflection and wonder. So honestly, there was one woman that wrote, Annabel Abbs' book Sleepless can turn lemons of sleep deprivation into a lemonade of inspiration. And I love that. Welcome, Annabelle.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
So, Annabel, congratulations on your book. Honestly, it was one of the best reads ever. And I have to say, reads, well, I do it by audio. But can you just tell us a little bit how it started for you? Because I know the intro for me just blew my mind. Deepest condolences, because I think you've lost members of your family and a puppy. Was that part of the reason how you started the book?
Yes, it was, although I had suffered from insomnia for about 25 years, but it was a sort of mild and manageable insomnia. But then fast forward to 2020, and this is during the pandemic in the first year before vaccines had been rolled out. At the end of the year, end of November, my stepfather died. 3 weeks later, my father died. And these were both unexpected and sudden deaths, and they weren't COVID deaths either. So then I bought a puppy for my family, for the kids to bond over. And then the puppy also died. And then there's another death, actually, that I didn't put in the book because it was just, my editor said that's just too much. But it was a friend of my 17-year-old daughter. Her friend took his own life. These four deaths were completely out of the blue. They were sudden. We hadn't expected them in any way, and they all happened within a 6-week period. So my family and I were just literally reeling from this tsunami of death. But as I'm an oldest child in my family, so I took it upon myself that I had to keep the whole show on the road. I had to make sure that my stepmother and my mother, who were both in lockdown then, they weren't able to see anyone. They were in some social isolation. So I had to make sure that they were okay and that they had food, and that my kids, who were also completely devastated, were okay, that everyone was at home. And so my days were really, really, really busy. That was partly a coping mechanism as well, I think. During the day, I just kept very busy organising all the funerals, getting justice for the puppy, looking after everyone. But at night, my sleep just vanished. I didn't sleep at all. And at that point, I had two choices, really. One was to go to my doctor and say, please give me sleeping pills. And the other was to go with the insomnia and see where it took me. And at that time, I started to experience night quite differently. And instead of my previous insomnia, which was, tossing and turning and really stressing and becoming anxious about the following day, I decided that the following day didn't matter. I had no choice. I was just going to be what I was going to be the following day. And so the night became a place that was really restful for me. It was dark, so I couldn't see anything. It was quiet. It was still.
Annabelle, just a question. If you suffered insomnia for 20 years prior, how did it change with enduring the grief day and night? How did that insomnia change?
The insomnia became something that I started to welcome. I started to really look forward to my nights. The physicality of the insomnia was that it was longer. So my insomnia before was, as you were saying earlier, I'd wake up for a couple of hours and lie there. This time the insomnia was, I woke up and I didn't get back to sleep. It was just awake. So I might fall asleep because I was exhausted, wake up a couple of hours later, and then that was it. Bingo. I was wide awake.
When you say you didn't sleep during the night, are you saying you didn't sleep at all during the night?
Well, my nights varied. So there were some nights when I didn't sleep at all.
Wow.
And there were some nights when I was just going in and out of sleep. So bereaved people do sleep slightly differently.
Right.
They tend to have more of the dream sleep, the sleep that we tend to have later on in the night, where we're dreaming, REM sleep, and less of the sort of deep restorative sleep that we usually have at the beginning of the night. So the sleep pattern of a bereaved person is typically a little bit different anyway.
Yes.
But I decided that I had to sort of embrace the darkness, because the darkness also gave me a way really of, this might sound a little bit woo-woo, but of reconnecting with the people and the puppy and everything that had gone out of our lives.
Yes.
Suddenly at night, things that during the day I didn't give myself permission to think. We are very different at night, and we are much less sort of controlled. Our emotions are less regulated. And at night, I could imagine that these people were still with me. Whereas, of course, my day brain is saying, no, that's it. They've gone. You've got to get over this and move on. And my night brain was saying, actually, you don't have to do that. You can be with them right now. So
you got comfort. You actually got some comfort during the time when you were awake, which is a beautiful thing.
Yeah, weirdly, it was really comforting, and it was really restful. And there is something very, very restful about being in complete darkness, turning all the lights off, none of those little blue winking Wi-Fi lights. The darkness became a place of refuge, really, where I could think and grieve and be alone but without being alone, if that makes sense.
You talk about in the book about your dad's spirit being with you at night.
Yeah, so I think for people who are religious, they have permission to have these sorts of feelings and emotions and senses. Perhaps during the day, they have a sort of place to go. But if you've been raised not to be religious, that all seems slightly, we've been raised in the age of science, haven't we? If you can't measure it and you can't monitor it and you can't survey it, then it doesn't exist. The night brain tells you a very different story. The night brain says, aha, there is so much you don't know. There is so much uncertainty that you have to learn to live with. Whereas the day brain is, no, that doesn't happen. The night tells you, you're not in control. You don't know what on earth is happening up in the stars. You have no idea. And that gives you a space to imagine and to feel a sense of connection that oddly we don't get in the day. Certainly that was my experience of it.
It's fascinating because, look, we all talk about catastrophizing, and honestly, everything's amplified at night. And here you are, you turned it around and you found the beauty in the silence and the beauty in the darkness of the quiet. It's such a positive take on it all.
Yeah, so the night became a really interesting place for me. And around the same time, I had started writing a book. I'd already actually been commissioned to write a book about female creativity. And I already had this hunch that women were more creative at night. So when I was awake for all night, I thought, okay, I'm going to start doing what all of these really imaginative and creative and in fact, women who were scientists, where a lot of them had worked at night in the past. And in fact, if you look back over diaries and journals, go back hundreds of years, night has always been a time for women. It was often the only time where they could be creative, do something that was just for them. It was also a time of caring. So, if you think 200 or 300 years ago, there were no hospitals, and it was a woman's role in the community. She did the night nursing and the night caring and the sitting beside someone who was dying, as well, of course, nursing her own children and looking after many children who died. So from diaries and journals, I had a sense that women were up often all night and certainly up throughout the night. And so I started to think, maybe all these headlines about imminent death, if you're awake at night, you're going to get dementia, you're going to get type 2 diabetes, you're going to become obese. I started to think, well, this isn't really stacking up. This is not what I was gleaning from women of the past. They were not dying early, some were, but not certainly not from lack of sleep, I don't think. They were certainly not getting dementia, they were not becoming obese or getting type 2 diabetes or having heart attacks. So all of the studies that have been making headlines and had been really stressing me out in the past, I've got to go back to sleep because otherwise I'll die. I started to question those studies and I started to dig out other studies. And I also started reaching out to neuroscientists and sleep scientists to say, this isn't stacking up for me. How come some of these women who were up with perhaps 10 or 15 children, nursing them night after night, looking after them through all these sicknesses, how come they lived 200, 300 years ago to be 70, 80, 90? This does not fit with the headlines I'm seeing now.
No, it doesn't at all. Because we hear that you're going to get sick and disease if you don't sleep. It's going to affect your heart. So that's why it's contrary to what we hear.
Yeah, it really is. There's sort of saying, I was listening to a podcast with Lewis Howes, and he was talking to Dr. Matthew Walker, who's sort of studied sleep. You probably know Annabel and dreams. And he's just such an advocate going, you've got to get the 7 hours sleep. Otherwise, he's sort of saying that's the time actually he was going, that's your best health insurance is your sleep. Whereas it's kind of, I guess, refreshing to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, so one of the things I sort of learned to question was the sleep scientists who are also employed by the sleep industry. So the sleep industry is now worth over $100 billion a year. So there are a lot of companies who are trying to sell us, whether that's supplements or mattresses or pharmaceutical companies trying to ship out huge amounts of sleeping pills. There are a lot of vested interest in having us think we need to sleep because if we don't, there'll be catastrophe ahead. So I started to question those. I started to question Matthew Walker, who's a brilliant scientist, but he does also work for companies who are
Of
selling sleep
course.
trackers, for example, and sleep supplements and things. So I started to think, well, if you're also being paid by these people, it's really hard you can't really suddenly come out and say, well, actually, I may have been a little bit wrong about that. And, plenty of people have survived who had broken nights all their life. So I question that. But I also spoke to a really interesting circadian biologist at Cambridge University who explained to me that he's been working on women. He just looks at women. So most of the male scientists, and they are mostly male scientists who are telling us we have to have this amount of sleep or we'll die. But this particular male scientist said he has been looking at sleep and just women. And he said to me that if women could not cope with night after night after night of broken sleep, the human race would have just died out, millennia back.
Wow.
He says that women are much better adapted to broken sleep. We don't get the metabolic disease that has been linked to short sleep. That is something that men are more
So
inclined
do
to
you
get.
think
So
women are protected? Like for evolution, women are protected.
that's exactly what he said. He said the women who could best cope with sleep deprivation were the ones who survived and who had the healthiest children and had the most children. So, those of us that don't sleep very well, we were the number one choice of breeding partner, if you like,
Yeah.
because we
Yeah.
could handle the sleepless nights. If you have a history of insomnia, you sort of have a level of resilience. And it sort of makes sense, really, doesn't it? If you're used to a few broken nights, and if you've had kids, you know about broken nights, you know that they're survivable.
What about the red eyes, Annabel? What about sort of like, I always find I make mistakes and, I'm stuffing up things because I just don't get the sleep. Whereas I wake up, if I've had a good night's sleep, I normally
Yeah.
bounce out of bed, and it's reassuring for us to feel that, it's okay not to get the sleep. But don't you think you don't function as well?
I certainly don't function as well. I can actually feel it. I can actually feel it in my brain. If I haven't had very much sleep, I suppose I don't function as efficiently and I'm a little bit more tired. But what I would say is there are two types of sleep deprivation. So if you have been awake all night, fretting and feeling anxious, then
Yes.
the next day, the fatigue is completely different from those
Ah.
nights where. So if you think of it, if you've been in those nights where you go to a really good party, and you don't get home till 3 a.m. and you've had a fantastic time, and then you wake up at 6 a.m. and you haven't had enough sleep and you feel a bit weary, but you're just also buzzing because that party was so good.
Maybe the alcohol's still in the system.
Maybe. Also, if you've had a very short night, you've caught a very early flight you've flown to Europe from Australia, you haven't had much sleep, you've only had a couple of hours sleep, but you get off the plane and you're really buzzing. You don't feel the fatigue in the same way. So I think there are different sorts of sleep deprivation. And I think what has to be tackled is not the sleep itself, but the source. What is it that's keeping you awake? That's the problem. And the sleep industry is really about putting a plaster over what I sometimes refer to as an axe wound. So the anxiety and the stress of not sleeping, I think now is more detrimental to our health than not sleeping itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So tell me something. What I love is you've looked at, obviously personally, how you dealt with insomnia. You've looked historically, you've looked scientifically. But let's look at some of these amazing women from the past, from the 17th, 18th century. One you actually put up on your Insta, couldn't believe it. This woman, Caroline Herschel. What a remarkable woman who suffered from insomnia, yet turned out to be this incredibly revered astronomer. Can you tell us a little about her?
Yeah, so Caroline Herschel was around, I think she was sort of born around 1750, so, 250 years ago, really. She got to be 98, and quite a few of
Wowza.
the insomniac women that I came across lived to be very old.
Wow.
So she was one of the very early ones. So no one really lived to be 98 back then. It was quite unusual. But she
Yes.
spent her nights, it was called, the term they used was sweeping the sky. So in the book Sleepless, I look at quite a few of the astronomers, because back then, to be an astronomer, you had to be up all night. It was all about, nothing, wasn't looking at photographs on computers. It was very much about getting your telescope out, or even just with your naked eye and just watching the sky all night long looking for meteors or comets or watching the phases of the moon, whatever they were doing. So they were awake all night. And they also then, of course, come the day, they had to get up and do their usual work, whether that was raising children or being a housewife or a housekeeper, as Caroline Herschel was. So during the day, Caroline was doing everything you would expect from an 18th century housewife. She was doing the shopping and the cooking and the sewing and the darning and looking after her brother, and also doing all his work as well, looking after his astronomical equipment.
How's it possible?
I know. How is it possible? It's possible that she was a short sleeper. So there are really interesting studies now that look at larks and owls and people's sleep requirement and how that correlates to their cognition. So there's a study that came out recently that showed that people who are typically early risers, so if you're typically a lark, getting up quite early in the morning and going to bed quite early, you need less sleep to be cognitively sharp than if you're what we call a night owl. So if you're a late riser. So late risers typically do need, it appears, about 7 to 8 hours sleep for their brain to function properly. But if you're a lark, it appears that you only need, 5 or 6 hours to be cognitively sharp.
Speaking of women from the past, Louise Bourgeois, is it?
Yeah, Louise Bourgeois also lived to be 98.
She was saying that people can be quite creative at night, like during the early hours with the quiet.
Yeah, so what happens in the brain is really important, I think, to understand, because I came up with this idea of the night self, because I started to realize that I thought differently, I felt differently. And at first I thought, it's because I've suffered this, this so much loss. And I'm grieving, and that's why I'm a bit whimsical, just a bit different at night. But actually now we know that at night the brain changes. So we know already that the body changes. So when it gets dark, our body reacts in numerous ways, which were designed to keep us safe, thousands of years ago, and which are still sort of hanging around now. So, for example, we produce different hormones. We produce melatonin, which helps us sleep. We also produce a hormone called leptin, which stops us feeling hungry. And that really dates back to when we were living in caves. And it was really important that we didn't wake up in the night feeling hungry and go outside and start foraging, because no doubt some lion would have gobbled us up. So we know that our blood pressure falls. So there are all these changes that go through our body at night, but the brain also changes. And it sort of rewires for nocturne. And one of the things that sleep scientists think happens is that the bit of the brain behind our forehead, which is called the prefrontal cortex, they think that part of the brain goes into partial hibernation, sort of goes to sleep effectively. And that part of the brain is the part of the brain that we think animals don't have, and that we humans have it in a particularly vigorous. In fact, it may be that animals don't have it at all. We don't really know. But in women, the prefrontal cortex is bigger and more active than it is in men. And this is really important because the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that keeps all our emotions regulated. It keeps us thinking in a very ordered and a very structured and a very methodical way. It's the part of the brain that weighs up risk versus reward. It's the part of the brain that judges and assesses and evaluates.
So where does the creativity sit there with the brain at night? How come you can become more creative in the darkness in the early hours?
Yeah. So when that prefrontal cortex shuts down, we start to think in a way that is, I would call it freer, more liberated. We start to think in a way that is more imaginative. We start to think in a way that is more creative, because that little voice that's saying you can't do that, or you don't do that like this, has gone. So that it's sort of it's the brain that keeps us thinking in very straight lines, that makes to-do lists and tells us how to behave properly. So that's gone.
How interesting.
Studies of people awake at night also show that they tend to be more reckless. There's a really interesting study called The Mind After Midnight, which was the first study that provided me with actual scientific evidence that the brain really is different. People who are on a diet are much more likely to break their diet in the middle of the night. If they wake up in the night, they're much more likely to go and eat that large slice of chocolate cake than during the day. Reformed smokers, if they wake up in the night, are much more likely to have a cigarette. Reformed alcoholics are much more likely to go and pour themselves a tot of whiskey if they wake up in the middle of the night. So that night brain is not so good at keeping us in order, controlling us.
That's incredible.
So it's a very freeing time, particularly for a woman, to think more laterally and more divergently and more
Yes.
creatively.
Well, hence this woman, Louise Bourgeois, at night she would write, wouldn't she? She would sketch and draw, and that was one way of her dealing with those emotions.
So women would
Wow.
write often creatively. They would often do a lot of journaling. They would often draw and sketch, and some of them would even, do enormous canvases with oil paints and things. They'd get all the paints out.
Wow.
And they often noticed that the work they produced during the night was very different to the work they produced during the day.
Ah,
And they would comment
wow.
on that in interviews and in their journals. In the book, I talk about Joan Mitchell. She was an American painter. And the first time she started painting at night, she woke up the next morning, she looked at this painting and she was just like, where the hell did that come from?
Wow.
And it just came from part of her imagination that presumably was normally, kept under lock and key.
Now, coming back to you, what sort of things did you do at night that were creative?
Well, I started by writing because I write anyway, so that was very easy for me.
And a brilliant writer, I might add.
Thank you. But then I decided that I wouldn't write what I normally write. So I would use my nights to write poetry and lyrics, which are things I would never give myself permission to do during the day. And also there were two forms of writing that I thought I was absolutely useless at. And I probably am absolutely useless. That's my day self. At night, it didn't bother me that I was useless. There was no one saying, you're useless at that. Why are you wasting your time with that? That's not very productive. That voice had gone. So I would sit and scroll out, lyrics to little songs in my head. I would write poems, and then I would do sketching and doodling. So Louise Bourgeois is really interesting because she sketched as a means of getting back to sleep. She found it really calming. And if you look at her night drawings, then they're not complicated at all. You would look at her night drawings and you would think, I can do that too. A lot of women used the time to study. A lot of women were out stargazing, looking at the night sky, which I also
and including you. Am I right? You moved a mattress out to look at the stars one night. What the hell did your husband say about that?
I think he was very relieved.
She's gone. She's on the roof.
My poor
Fabulous. I love it. So tell me about that. Like, what was that about?
Well, I just thought initially I was looking at all these astronomers who were spending their nights looking at the stars, and I thought I'll take the mattress out, and I've got a little tiny, it's not a roof terrace really, it's just a tiny bit of flat roof. So I thought I'll take this little tiny mattress out there and I'll just lie there and I'll try and understand what it was like for these earlier astronomers to be looking at the night sky. And I'd never really looked at the stars. I just, we rush out of our houses, we get in our cars and we rush off and we don't really look up.
Yes.
So I lay there on this mattress, and for the first time in about 3 or 4 months, I just fell asleep. So that was the first thing. I was gazing up for a few minutes and literally I fell asleep. And that was better than any sleeping pill I could ever have taken.
Wow.
So my first revelation was there was something about that view that was really calming.
You wrote in your book, someone said that looking up at the night sky when she couldn't sleep, it was like wrapping a blanket over her.
Yeah, it's really, really comforting. And no one really understands how or why it's so comforting. But from my point of view, as a person who was grieving, I think I also had a sense that those spirits were somehow, they were there with me in the stardust, in the night sky. Somehow they were there.
Yeah.
So looking at the night sky has also been shown to generate a sense of awe in people, a sense of enchantment. There's a feeling there's another world out there that we don't get that sense of during the day, and that there's possibility up there that we just don't really understand.
No, I totally get that. So tell me what else you did at night, because you're the one that wrote the book. What about walking at night?
So from reading all these journals and letters, I also discovered that the women of the past, they were all much more comfortable in complete darkness than we are. So I think we have so much light in our lives, and there's street lights everywhere, and bright headlamps on our cars, that we're not really comfortable with the darkness that they were comfortable with. So these women would often, to my surprise, go out for walks. So if you look at the diaries of Dorothy Wordsworth, for example, who was the sister of the poet William Wordsworth, she writes throughout her diaries, I walked out last night, looked at the stars. She's out at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. She's looking at glowworms. She's looking at the moths. She's looking at the moon. And I just thought, so all these women are out walking. What's wrong? Why am I so scared?
Well, they weren't exactly turning a light on in their house, so they were going from a dark house to the dark outside as well. That was that era.
Yeah, candles were expensive. So they were often in the dark and quite comfortable in the dark. So I thought, well, if they can do it, well, what the hell is wrong with me? Why can't I actually
Wow.
go out
Go
the front door and
girl.
go out my
Go, Annabel.
I started by just going out in the garden.
How far did you go? Did you take a torch?
No, I didn't take a torch because the first thing I sort of learned, I taught myself really, was about night vision and the way in which our eyes adapt to the darkness. So as soon as you have light, be that a torch or a headlamp, you kill your night vision. So then if something happens to your torch, your phone goes dead, you're in pitch black and you really can't see. But if you let your eyes acclimatize, the great thing actually about waking up in the middle of the night is you're already acclimatized to the darkness. You're ready to go.
Wow.
So I would just get out of my bed and creep outside. Of course, often I didn't want to disturb.
What did your husband think with that one? I mean, really, sneaking out at night, where are you really going?
I think he was just relieved that I was no longer jumping
I love
around.
it when you say that. He was relieved.
I think that's a good excuse when you hop out of bed going, actually, hi, honey, I'm just going for a night walk.
How long did you walk for, though? Like, how long did you go out at night? Seriously.
I did two sorts of night walking. The first sort of night walking I did was going out when it was dark, but I would go out with a female night guide who would take a group of women walking.
Wow.
So that was how I got used to being in the dark.
What time of night?
So we would walk from usually about 7 in the evening. This is in the winter, so it is pitch black, until about 10 or 11 or midnight.
I love this.
Yay.
Nicola, we've got to do
That's
it.
great. Then I can go and tuck myself into bed and get some sleep.
Exactly.
I do like a little bit of sleep.
When you come back to bed, you sleep like a log. There's something about
Wow.
that darkness and the movement because you're walking slowly. You're not running, so you're not building up a sweat or getting all that adrenaline going from a tough run. It's a really slow meditative walk.
I really love the idea of a walk before bed. This is a great one for me. It resonates. I'm going to do it.
Annabel, you were so inspired by this because it's sort of like the self that we find at night, that inner self that we would never find if you're just sort of snoring the night away. But if you are awake, it's such a positive spin of looking within. You've really given us so many gifts here.
And how the brain changes, Nicola, at night. The hormones and everything.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I would say to anyone wanting to discover their night self, I would certainly never tell someone to set their alarm for 2 a.m. If you're sleeping, just sleep.
No.
Because you do need to. But if you're awake, instead of just lying there and becoming anxious, and I think audiobooks are great, to go back to your earlier point, instead of lying there and becoming anxious, maybe wait 20 minutes. If you haven't got back to sleep, then get up and do something because it'll be much easier for you to go back to sleep an hour or 2 hours later. So if you're in the middle of the country and you feel sufficiently emboldened and you know there's no one around, then take a short walk. If you've got a dog, great. I take a big stick. Take something that just makes you feel better, even though there's no one out there. Make sure that you look up at the sky. So hopefully you've got an amazing clear night.
Well, we do have a lot of trekkers in Australia too. Di, we interviewed Di Westerway, and she created Wild Women on Top. And they do sometimes hikes, they do charities that go all through the night. Kind of builds your confidence in other ways too, because you've got this sort of like nearly superpower, because in the night when everyone else is sleeping, you're gaining all these extra skills.
And extra steps.
And steps. Annabel, we've got a couple of our signature questions. If you could share a back fence with anybody on planet Earth, who would it be and why?
Well, I'm actually going to be very dull and say it would be Caroline Herschel, who you talked about earlier.
See, I love her.
I've been spending time with her, and I want to know, how did she survive with no sleep, or did she have naps in the afternoon, or did she do yoga nidra? What did she do to catch up?
I'd be there. I want to know, how did she survive? She worked all day and was awake as an astronomer at night and had kids and everything, lived to 98. Cool. Seriously. How did she do it? Me and Nicola will be down the back fence and want to meet her too.
Absolutely. I'll be there. And you know what? I don't care what time of night, Didi. 3 o'clock, 4 a.m., 5 a.m., I'm there.
Well, you know what? Annabel will just be coming back from her night walk. Last question. If you had an opportunity of chatting to your 20-year-old self, what would you say to her and why?
I think I would probably say, don't think so much about being comfortable, being safe, and being happy. I think those three things are in hindsight, as a woman in my 50s,
Yes.
I think they are slightly overrated. And that when I look back now, the things I remember most vividly and that I think were most transformative are the occasions when I was neither comfortable, safe, nor particularly happy, if that makes sense.
Wow. That's
Living on the edge more.
Those are the
Wow.
spaces where we grow.
Through the hardest times, they
Yeah.
just say the biggest growth is through adversity.
It's so
And,
true.
that is such a great message, isn't it, for everybody listening
It's
here?
true.
Annabel, thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining us at this Aussie back fence here,
I think
full of bumps along the road. And
thank you, because it's been a total inspiration. Because, as I said up front of this interview, that I don't go through a day that somebody doesn't say to me, I didn't sleep well last night. And these are another just alternatives, suggestions of how you can cope with that. And it's a positive take. And get the book. It's called Sleepless. Nicola and I read different things, but both of us collaborated and just loved it. And thank you, because you're
absolutely,
a beautiful writer. It
it's a
flows.
gift to the world, your book,
Yeah.
Annabel. Thank you.
I loved it.
We'll put all the links on our show notes.
Yes.
And so for everybody here, we'll be back in your ears next Monday. And don't forget to rate and review. And Diney, Annabel, I mean, really, we want everyone to give some stars. What do you say for
Well,
Annabel?
we're doing this interview at night time, and my brain's going into that wonderful, wonderful phase of inhibitions running wild. I'm going to go 50 out of
Shooting
5.
stars, I can see.
So, Annabel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, everybody. Ciao, ciao. Thanks for listening.